Today is Friday, February 20th, 2026, and we are with Booker T. Washington indeed today. And uh, I'll start off by saying thank you for being here. Um, Sometimes it's hard to step into a room, right, of reading if you're not a big reader or you're not a book addict. So I appreciate you all coming in just to hang out for a little bit. Um, but if you didn't know, Booker T. Washington, 1856 to 1915, was born a slave on a Virginia farm, later freed. He headed and developed the Tuskegee Institute and became a leader in education. Widely considered a spokesman for his people, he emphasized social concern in three books as well as his autobiography. Every once in a blue moon, I'll pause in between because I have baby Victor here as co-host in the background, and when he's ready, he'll act a fool. So then I have to tend to him to come back on again. But we're doing live reading right now. So live means live, and that means that you'll hear things in the background. I thank you all for being here. Um, Again, we're here to learn more, learn together, and expand our knowledge. And I thought I would share the introduction with you to Booker T. Washington because a lot of people are not aware of Booker T. Washington, although you would think folks would be, but not even I myself am aware fully of Booker T. Washington, and just realize how much I can probably most likely relate to Booker T. Washington. So, anyways, moving forward, when Booker T. Washington published in 1901 his classic autobiography, Up from Slavery, he was at the threshold of his greatest power and influence as the premier spokesman for Black Americans in the segregation era. Later that year, President Theodore Roosevelt invited Washington to dinner at the White House, ushering in an era in which Washington was not only the advisor of presidents, but the acceptable Black sage, the almoner, a philanthropist, and the boss of Black America. Though Up from Slavery chronicles Washington's rise with reasonable accuracy and foreshadows his subsequent exercise of power as the Black leader most acceptable to whites, Washington wrote the book to show his life and social philosophy in a favorable light. The autobiography presented him to the world not as the complex man he privately was, but as the exemplar of the Puritan work ethic he believed in. The reader may therefore find useful a brief outline of Washington's life, shorn of his mask and myth and continuing beyond the date of the autobiography to his death in 1915. Booker T. Washington was born in 1856, a mulatto slave on a small Virginia farm, not a plantation as he suggests, and Up from Slavery. He was freed in 1865 at the age of 9, too young to have experienced at firsthand the harshness of the slavery system. He spent the early years of freedom in Malden, West Virginia, working in the salt furnaces and coal mines as a child laborer. Washington escaped from grinding poverty by becoming a houseboy of the leading family in the town, and he attended a one-room school founded by the Blacks of Malden and later aided by Freedmen's Bureau. From 1872 to 1875, and I thank you all, each and every one of you all, for being here and listening. From 1872 to 1875, Washington attended Hampton Institute, then a normal and agricultural secondary school, earning part of his tuition and board by part-time and summer work. Here, he came under the spell of the head of the school, General Samuel Chapman Armstrong. A Union Army veteran, Armstrong transferred to his Black charges the missionary zeal of his parents in Hawaii. Believing that slavery had cursed Blacks with indolence by its lack of incentives to labor, Armstrong sought above all else to inculcate in his students the virtues of self-reliance, hard work, and thrift. Booker T. Washington became Armstrong's aptest pupil. He later described Armstrong as more than a father to him and as the most perfect specimen of man, physically, mentally, and spiritually, that he had ever seen. Washington remade his own life in the image of Armstrong and became the chief disciple of Hampton methods of education. After graduation from Hampton, Booker T. Washington returned to his home community as a school teacher, as he was encouraged to do by the white faculty of Hampton. His ambition stirred by his experiences at Hampton, Washington soon began to cast about for a more lucrative profession than teaching a one-room school. Though he does not directly allude to these experiments in Up From Slavery between 1875 and 1879, Washington made serious attempts at the study of law and the ministry. He described these more candidly in The Story of My Life and Work, an autobiography written a year earlier than Up From Slavery, primarily for Black readers. After spending the summer of 1877 as a stump speaker advocating before Black audiences the relocation of the state capital to nearby Charleston, Washington, began in earnest to study law. In fact, read Blackstone and several elementary law books preparatory to the profession of the law in the office of a local white Republican politician. Washington soon abandoned his study, turning pages, you all. Abandoned this study because of a nagging feeling that it would be going contrary to my teaching at Hampton and would limit me to a much smaller sphere of educating my people after the manner in which I had been taught at Hampton, end quote. Washington then spent the most obscure year of his life at a theological seminary in Washington, D.C. He does not name Wayland Seminary or his study for the ministry in Up From Slavery, speaking only of spending 8 months of study in Washington. It is not clear whether Washington failed to meet the school's standards or whether the school failed to meet his standards, but the experience was the beginning of his lifelong scornful remarks on the shortcomings of higher education and the immortality of city life. Perhaps Washington intuitively sensed that the careers of politician and preacher would be blind alleys of his ambition in the post-Reconstruction era. In the increasingly secular Black world, it was harder for a minister to be an all-purpose leader. And the Black politicians were soon to lose their constituency through the disfranchisement of Black voters. General Armstrong solved Booker T. Washington's career dilemma by inviting him to teach at Hampton Institute for 2 years. In 1881, on Armstrong's recommendation, Washington went to the Black Belt of Alabama to found Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. For the next decade, he threw his phenomenal energy into building his institution, mollifying the local whites and Alabama state officials, and raising money in the North. Washington skillfully exploited the popularity of industrial education among all of his constituencies. Southern whites approved of industrial education as a means of keeping Blacks in agricultural and other lowly occupations, whereas many Blacks saw it, as Washington did, as a means of gaining economic independence from the sharecrop system and becoming small businessmen and property owners. In the North, there was a remnant of support for Black colleges for the education of clergymen and other professionals, but the Peabody Education Fund, the John F. Slater Fund, and the rising new class of industrial millionaires endorsed industrial education and favored Hampton, Tuskegee, and similar industrial institutes for Blacks. Washington was remarkable in his ability to gain the endorsement of conservative Southern white leaders, the money of wealthy Northerners, and the patronage of Southern Blacks eager to share in the material rewards of commercial age. Tuskegee soon rivaled Hampton in the size of its physical plant and student body. Despite his success as an educator, Washington was a relatively flipping pages, you all. was a relatively obscure figure until 1895 when a single speech thrust him into national fame and recognition as a black spokesman. Earlier in the same year, Frederick Douglass, the champion of abolition, civil rights, and political action, and the preeminent black leader of the 19th century, had died. In what became known as the Atlanta Compromise Address, Washington proposed a racial settlement that contrasted sharply with Douglas's approach, speaking to a mixed audience of Northerners, Southern whites, and blacks at Southern Commercial Convention designed to attract Northern investment. He proposed a triple alliance of Northern capitalists, the white leadership class of a New South, and blacks. Um, Washington offered to trade black acquiescence and disfranchisement and some measure of segregation, at least for the time being, in return for white promises to allow blacks to share in the economic and educational growth that Northern investment would bring. In language rich in imagery, he urged both races to cast down your bucket where you are. He couched his race relations formula in a memorable sentence. And all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand, and all things essential to mutual progress. Whites of all sections, anyways, of the nation hailed Washington's compromise with enthusiasm, and blacks generally accepted it as the best they could negotiate in an age of disfranchisement and segregation already underway. Okay. The Atlanta Compromise brought Washington personal fame as the Negro of the hour and power as the chief intercessor between black and white. But it was a Faustian bargain that came to haunt his efforts to improve the status of blacks in a time of white aggression, violence, and encroachment. Whites of the whole country gave him approval as a conservative and non-threatening black leader, but whenever he tried to move beyond the Atlanta Compromise, white disapproval reeled him back in. An early example of this was the reaction to his speech at the Chicago Peace Jubilee in 1898 that celebrated the end of the Spanish-American War. Washington said with unaccustomed forthrightness that a race willing to die for its country should have the highest opportunity to live for its country, and that the trenches in Cuba should be the internal burial place of all which separates us in our business and civil relations. The Southern newspapers forced him on the defensive by charging that, quote, business and civil relations, end quote, including social relations, and therefore violated the, quote, separate as the fingers, end quote, agreement. We will return, ladies and gentlemen, in less than a minute. I thank you all for being here and listening to our live reading. We are in the book, one of many of the books that I read all day long, Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery. We will return in give me about 2 minutes, you all. I have a little baby monster here in the background. I might have to change a diaper. Be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am back in action. I thank you all. And yes, I did just change a quick diaper. Anyways, got a 1-year-old. He's on a mission, but it never stops me from reading, and he knows it. All right, continuing. Washington sought to influence whites through a great outpouring of speeches, articles, and books. This set him apart from the most of the lesser black leaders who confined their efforts almost exclusively to blacks. Washington saw his role as a sort of axis between the races, the only man who could negotiate with each group and keep the peace by holding extremists on both sides in check. He was ever conscious that he could destroy his unique influence by an instant of self-indulgent flamboyance. Okay. While his manner toward powerful whites was differential or different, shall you say, right, to a fault, Washington ruled over the black community with the iron hand of a machine boss. His racial strategy was not to confront the whites, but to enhance black strength in the long term by self-improvement, racial solidarity, mutual aid, and institution building and education, church, business, and mutual aid societies. Okay. Washington developed what became known among blacks as the Tuskegee Machine, a nationwide network of his supporters and lieutenants in every avenue of black life. He built in the South, where the great majority of blacks lived at that time, a regional constituency. My lips are getting all twisted tied here with this baby. Constituency, okay? So let me go back, you all. He built in the South, where the great majority of blacks lived at that time, a regional constituency of farmers, school teachers, and small businessmen. He founded and was president for life of the National Negro Business League. He had a powerful influence on the Baptist Church, the largest of the black dominations. His allies were potentates, or I believe that's how you pronounce this word, potentates. Let's see. I don't like to guess too much. You know what I do? I pull out the handy dandy Webster's dictionary, buddy, and we look up the word. We don't guess. We don't perpetrate a fraud. We look at the word in the dictionary. We don't need Google. Go to the dictionary. We open up the book. All right. So potentates, I believe it looks like it's pronounced potentates. So I'm going to find the word in the dictionary wall, and we're going to see how we pronounce it. And you might be learning something different yourself too. And while I'm trying to look up the word, I have a 1-year-old that is going nuts on the floor, standing up, trying to walk, and I'm trying to hold them all together and read to you all at the same time on a live video. Isn't that something? Awful. Yep, he says awful. He's in the background. He says awful. Man, that's one of his main words. Yep, he learned that from his mother. Awful. Yep. Let's see. Okay, so let's go back to what we were doing here before I lose myself. Pot. We are trying to find a word that we cannot. Okay, here we go. I think I got it here, you guys. Potents. It's a part of potents. Potentates. So let's see. Potent and blah, 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 potentates. Okay, so I think I found it, you all. And I believe it's pronounced pot and tat. Potentate. That's what it is. Potentate. One who wields controlling power, is a ruler. Potentate. In this case, it says potentates, and it's plural. So that means it was a lot of rulers. Okay, so if you didn't know that word, now you know. Potentate. Now, I know I sound robotic, but it's potentate or potentates, which are rulers, okay? Rulers. So if you guys are listening, highlight that in your mind, and I'm going to highlight it in my dictionary. And again, potentate means one who wields controlling power. Now we go back to our reading, and now we can understand it even more clearly. Okay, his allies were potentates of the leading black fraternal orders. He controlled the editorial policies of nearly all the black weekly newspapers through subsidies and in a few cases through outright ownership. It was in politics, however, that Washington developed the most elaborate tentacles of the Tuskegee machine. During the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft from 1901 to 1913, Washington never held public office and minimized publicly the importance of politics. Okay, instead he controlled the black patronage of the party in power and used it to reward his key supporters and all the centers of black population. He devoted an inordinate amount of his time and energy to keeping his lieutenants in federal offices and directing the Republican campaign for the black vote in the northern states. Washington used the political arm of his machine to bind to him those blacks most inclined to criticize his conservative racial policies, the lawyers, politicians, and other professional men. Now, though Booker T. Washington remained the most powerful black leader of his time from the Atlantic Compromise in 1895 until his death in 1915, there gradually developed a challenge to his leadership. Black college graduates who call themselves the talented 10, though they were nearer to 1 in 100, felt that they were the natural leaders of the race and that the self-made Washington had usurped their place. A young Harvard graduate, flipping pages, you all. A young graduate, William Monroe Trotter, began the revolt by disrupting Washington's speech in a black church in what came to be known as the Boston Riot of 1903. For that, I recommend, what's the book again? I believe it's Radical something Radical. Anyways, I just ordered the book to make sure that I have it for my mobile library that's going to be starting up soon, and I want to be able to offer that book. I believe it's Black Radical. I believe I have it. I can't remember so many book titles. Anyways, I believe it's Black Radical. But anyways, so I would recommend that book, being that we're talking a little bit about that. But anyways, going back up to William Monroe Trotter began the revolt by disrupting Washington's speech in a black church in what came to be known as the Boston Riot of 1903. Leadership of these black radicals soon passed, however, to W.E.B. Du Bois. There's another book that I can recommend for you for that too, for W.B. Du Bois. I can't remember the name right now, but it is a big old orange thick book, and it's great. A distinguished scholar and polemicist who held a Harvard doctorate and taught sociology at Atlanta University. In 1905, Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, dedicated to black protest against racial injustice and to scathing criticism of Washington's accommodationism. Through his annual meetings and declarations, the Niagara movement scored many points against Washington intellectually, but it was no match for the Tuskegee machine organizationally. Washington embraced blacks regardless of persuasion, as long as they maintained a personal loyalty to him, and he had powerful white allies, whereas the Niagarites, right? That's the proper way to pronounce it. Niagarites had no white allies and rejected all but like-minded blacks devoted to civil rights and a strategy of outspoken protest. The Niagara movement had only a few hundred members. Washington had a following of both races, numbering hundreds of thousands. Nevertheless, Washington feared the loss of his power, though always optimistic. He could not fail to notice the mounting evidence of white determination, particularly in the South, but also in the North, to fix blacks in a separate permanent underclass. The Atlanta race riot in 1906 was one symbol of this trend. In the same year, President Roosevelt dismissed 3 companies of black regular troops on the basis of flimsy evidence of their involvement in a fracas with white civilians near their camp in Brownsville, Texas. Washington went to Atlanta to assist in the restoration of order and the shaky beginning of interracial cooperation. After the Brownsville dismissal, however, he refused to repudiate Roosevelt or the Republican Party. Washington turned to secret methods to undermine the system of racial discrimination that he publicly acquiesced in, and at the same time, he launched underground attacks on his black critics. In the deepest secrecy, he raised funds, hired lawyers, and directed the strategy of test cases against the Louisiana and Alabama grandfather clauses, against racial discrimination on the Jim Crow Railroad cars, against the exclusion of blacks from juries when black criminal defendants were on trial, and against the widespread Southern practice of peonage or debt slavery. Washington clearly did not take these actions as a means of answering his black critics, for he kept his part in the court cases secret, except to a handful of confidants. Against Du Bois, Trotter, and the Niagara movement, Washington used ruthless methods of espionage, provocation, and okay, just reconnecting. Sorry that you all lost me there for a quick minute. I'm going to catch back up here. So, various methods of espionage, provocation, and sabotage that seem utterly invariant with the Sunday school morality he professed and Up from Slavery and his other writings and speeches. Uh, let's see here. Washington never tried to reconcile his secret machinists with his public life, perhaps because being secret, they did not pragmatically, sorry you guys, pragmatically required justification. In the last few years of his life, Washington suffered setbacks through he remained until his death the most powerful black man in the United States. Let's make that clear. 1909, some of Washington's white allies deserted him and joined with the Niagara movement, blacks, to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Washington refused to join the new civil rights organization, and despite an initial truce with him, the NAACP soon found itself in direct opposition to his leadership. In 1911, Washington was assaulted and severely beaten by a white man under rather embarrassing circumstances in a seedy neighborhood of New York. Washington subsequently lost his court case against the man, a fact that weakened his moral authority. Perhaps because of this or because of the challenge of the NAACP, Washington became more forthright in his public opposition to the segregation of federal offices in Washington, residential segregation, the inflammatory racism of the movie Birth of a Nation, and other trends toward racial discrimination. When the Southern-born Democratic leader Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913, Washington lost the control over black political patronage that was an important element in the Tuskegee machine. At the same time, however, he was augmenting his influence on Northern educational philanthropy and directing it into improvement of the Southern public schools for blacks through the Anna T. Jeanes Foundation and Julius Goldenwald's aid toward the construction of black rural schools. When Washington died in 1915, his little empire died with him. He had not prepared a suitable successor, and the great migration from the rural South to the northern cities was already underway. We will return in less than 2 minutes, you all. I thank you all for tuning in and listening, and we should be done shortly with this introduction. If we're not, then we'll just have to go into another two. I think we're going to have to go into part two. I don't think we'll finish today. Actually, we're still in the introduction. We will return in less than 2 minutes. Thank you all for being here. All right, I apologize, you all. That took a little bit longer, and we are continuing indeed. All righty. So Washington's social philosophy and racial strategies, so well attuned to the Southern rural base and the segregation era, could not adjust to the change in Black um, demography and outlook, right? Long before he undertook his autobiography, Washington sensed early in his speaking career that audiences responded to the drama of his struggle up from slavery, poverty, ignorance, and weakness to a position of affluence and influence. His standard speech was biographical, a string of anecdotes from his experience, each illustrating a moral. I apologize, you all. I'm quite tongue tied right now. A baby in my arms. The autobiographical style that came so naturally to Washington, turning pages, also suited a 19th century literary convention. The narrative of former slaves represented a major part of Afro American literature. It was probably Walter Hines Page, then of Houghton, Mifflin and Company, who first suggested in 1896 that Washington write his autobiography. Washington, however, sent his first autobiography, The Story of My Life and Work, to the obscure subscription book firm of J.L. Nichols and Company of Naperville, Illinois. It published the book in 1900, selling it successfully door to door in the Black community. Washington was deeply disappointed, however, by the amateurish quality of the book and blamed the young Black ghostwriter he had hired to write it for most of its faults. Even as the story of my life and work was being published, Washington was already planning a more ambitious effort with the guidance of some of the nation's leading editors and publishers to enhance his image as the Black spokesman among the general reading public. Independently of Page, S.S. McClure, publisher of McClure's magazine and soon to be famous as the father of the muckrakers, suggested to Washington in 1899 that he write a series of autobiographical. Why can't I get that word out good? Autobiographical. Autobiographical articles. Anyways, a few months later, a representative of Doubleday, McClure and Company offered Washington a book contract. While Washington debated with himself the propriety of another autobiography only a year after the first one, Doubleday and McClure parted company, and the firm was reorganized as Doubleday, Page and Company. Walter Hines Page, the new partner, enthusiastically endorsed the project he had suggested 4 years earlier. A native North Carolinian whose lifelong dream had been to lay the ghost of the Confederate dead and to make the South more like the North. Page had admired Washington since the Atlanta address. Quote, in my eyes and in yours, unquote, he wrote the Tuskegean, quote, the principal element of success is, of course, the effect it will have on public opinion and its influence in furthering the good cause. But incidentally, I think it stands a very good chance, too, of reaching a very considerable financial success, unquote. All right. So, for the new autobiography, Washington chose a talented new ghostwriter, Max Bennett Thrasher, a white Vermonter. Thrasher had been educated in a good secondary school, the St. Johnsbury Academy. After teaching school for a while and serving as a small town postmaster, he worked as a Boston newspaper reporter and as assistant superintendent of a Boston school for indigenous boys. Thrasher attracted Washington's attention by a series of magazine articles on a charities and correction, as a new field of social work was then called. Thrasher visited the Tuskegee Negro Conference as early as 1895 as a reporter and gradually began to handle Tuskegee's public relations. By an agreement in 1899, Washington paid Thrasher $600 a year to write articles on Tuskegee Institute, but he continued to reside in Boston. Following Washington's rule that white employees could not reside full-time on the campus over the next 4 years until his death from, I believe it's called periodontitis. Thrasher wrote articles, drafts of several books, and even letters that appeared over Washington's signature. He brought to his work as a ghostwriter a willingness to be subservient to Washington's purposes, but also a good reporter's concern for factual accuracy. Now, I have one more passage that I'm going to read to you all before we end today's live, and then I have to tend to this child. So up from slavery, however, bears unmistakably the marks of Washington's style and personality. Sometime in the summer of 1900, Washington began to dictate autobiographical notes to Thrasher on trains or between trains as they traveled together on Washington speaking and funding raising tours. Washington then wrote a draft of the autobiography from Thrasher's notes and let Thrasher smooth out the rough spots of the manuscript. On occasion, Washington would dictate or write a rough outline of a chapter, which Thrasher would revise and give to the publishers. Though Washington sometimes seemed insensitive to the responsibilities of his authorship of such a personal document, this was partly because, as a public man, his time was not entirely his own. And he kept a tight rein on his ghostwriter. A letter from Thrasher to Washington in October 1900 gives a hint of the relationship between author and ghost. Thrasher wrote that the first article they had agreed to serialize in the Outlook magazine had been arranged as we decided on the train, end quote. He had added, quote, I have not left out anything that you wrote except that one brief paragraph or perhaps a dozen lines in the first copy, which you told me yourself you had decided to omit, end quote. And that is where I'm going to stop. Why? Because the introduction is so long in this book, and I'm excited to continue to read it. However, I do have a child, and I do have responsibilities, and I can't allow him to scream so much in the background. But I do like to take the time to come in and make sure that you all are read to, because some folks are just not picking up books, and that's okay. No judgment zone. But if you're not going to pick up the book, I'm going to read it to you if I have it. Because you can gain still the information that way too as well. Thank you all for being here. Have a beautiful and blessed day. And keep reading. Read.